Okay. Hello, I'm Joel West from Continuing Forward, and today we'll be discussing the book, The Great Dechurching by Jim Davis and Michael Graham, the lead pastor and parishioner in an Orlando non-denominational church. And to talk about the book, I have two clergy here from the Reformed Episcopal Church. And for those who don't know the REC, it's long used the 1928 prayer book, but over the last 3 decades, under the leadership of Bishop Royal Grote and now Bishop Ray Sutton, has emphasized high church Anglicanism that would be familiar to many continuing Anglicans. And so my two guests are Father Tony Melton, planting rector of Christ the King in a northern suburb of Atlanta, and with the flashy robes, Father Michael Vinson, planting rector of St. Benedict's in an eastern suburb of Dallas. And among other things, I was the TA for these two men when they taught Anglican church planting last fall at Cranmer House. And Cranmer House will be offering this course again in early 2026. So Father Tony, Father Michael, would you please introduce yourselves?
Yeah, Tony, why don't you go first?
Sure. I got 5 kids, and I live in Marietta, and planted in 2020. Landed in 2019. It was a parachute drop plant, and very passionate about church planting. I serve as the canon for church planting for the Diocese of the Southeast in the Reformed Episcopal Church. I also work a lot with Always Forward, which is the ACNA's church planting ministry and arm, providing coaching, assessment, and training. And yeah, Joel, is there anything else that I should mention?
Well, I'm pretty much a lifelong Anglican, and so the evangelical aspect of the book was a little bit unfamiliar to me. Was it more familiar to you?
Yes. Oh, yeah. Yeah. I was raised in evangelicalism, raised in Calvary Chapel, back when my family lived in California and we moved to Missouri. Still went to Calvary Chapel, which is kind of a Jesus movement.
We saw the movie.
Oh, yeah. There you go. That was we went to Costa Mesa where they did all the baptisms. So,
Yeah.
but yeah, non-denom, went to Dallas Theological Seminary for seminary, and then Cranmer for another degree. But yeah, this was my upbringing. And so it was very interesting to me to learn the story of evangelicalism through this book. I definitely think that the authors have some great insights about how to respond to that hemorrhaging. I also think there's an enormous amount that we can learn within our own tradition from the book.
Which is what we'll get to.
Yeah.
So we have Beauty Before Age.
Wait, that's the truth. Yeah, so that segue. Well, first, I'm happy to say that I've been my friendship with Tony's gone, I don't know, coming over 10 years now.
That's right.
So I'm happy to still call him my friend. And so, yeah, I'm in Rockwall, Texas, just east of Dallas. And I've been married for 31 years to my wife, Jody. We have 3 kids, 4 grandchildren. So the Lord has blessed us. So we were the first of the REC 100 church plants. And so we were the first to kind of venture out, and then everything kind of started falling in line behind that. So we're kind of like the first child, the mistakes that were made and things that maybe you don't do with the second and third and fourth one. But God's providence was with us. Bishop Sutton, Canon Grote, who's soon to be Bishop Grote, his support as National Canon Missioner. So it's been wonderful to be a part of this from the beginning, so to speak. My background is I was raised Roman Catholic, so I'm the oldest of 3 boys. My mother had me in the church, baptized as an infant, acolyte, Catholic school for a time. And so that's the foundation. But interestingly, I had kind of I don't know how to phrase it, but a revitalization of faith when I was around 30. And that happened in the evangelical context. And so I didn't come out of Roman Catholicism bitter about that, but found that in evangelicalism, the Lord kind of reignited a spark in me. And so I think of my second phase of Christianity, so to speak, has been very influenced, was very shaped in evangelicalism, free churches, etc., before I ultimately came back, obviously, to Anglicanism. So,
Okay, thank you, gentlemen. So we can get on to the book, and I know I've read it recently, writing a review for Cranmer Theological Journal, and you guys read it a lot earlier for your own ministries. But just to summarize for those who haven't read the book, the authors estimate that about 40 million people have left Dechurched in recent decades, and their book seems to really be about three different things: why people left, mostly evangelicals they focus on, which ones might come back, and how to avoid dechurching your own members. Those were kind of the three major takeaway goals of the book. And I hadn't really even heard of this book until you were teaching the class last fall, and you strongly recommended it to the students who were taking this church planting class. So why did you think they would benefit from reading this book?
well, I'll jump in first, if that's okay. So I stumbled upon this book from the statistical standpoint. So I was preparing a talk for our general or our diocesan synod, and came across the statistics of something like 46 or 47% of adults for the first time in the Pew history are not attending church regularly. So it was shocking and got everybody's attention, and that led me to read the book. And so, and I know we'll get into some of the main, I think, the value of this book, but this, to me, at the time, it framed the current situation that we're in, the sober reality of the culture, especially in the United States. And for me, it was helpful to have those profiles. So the empirical data was one thing, but I liked how they basically embodied the statistics into a person, and kind of tried to explicate motivation, value, why they're doing or moving away, or why they would come back. So I really appreciated that, and it was very insightful, and hopefully I can share some of those things over the course of this. But I just thought it was very impactful and very arresting at the time.
Okay. Tony?
Well, when we landed in Cobb County, Georgia, I wasn't particularly excited to plant here, to be honest. Vanny and I, my wife, we've always been called to go to more dechurched areas, or not dechurched, unchurched areas. And this, but what the Lord really stirred in my heart was that this is an area that is primarily dechurched, and the rates of regular church attenders back in the 70s and 80s was enormous in Cobb County. It was a buckle of the Bible Belt. But now, pre-2020, it's under 25%. You can only imagine what that is now, post-2020. So, when we landed, my heart started to be stirred for people that had recently left the church, and to really try to figure out, how do you reach these people? Because they're not far gone from being in the fold. And so we tried a lot of things and failed a lot of times, but we started to learn how to succeed. The reason why I love this book is because I read it after, and it really named a lot of the things that I had experienced in reaching people that had recently dechurched. It also gave new ideas, but for me, it was just a very confirming book to read. Oh, this is what we've figured out on the ground. But someone to do like a total analysis of it, I think that they nailed so many things about how to minister to those who are in post-Christendom, which used to be Christendom.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we'll get into many of those insights, but just if you had to give just one example of, to me, when I read the book, the word provocative came to mind. Provoking new ways of looking at things. So if you can just name one thing that kind of changed your thinking, or one insight, what would it be, Father Tony?
Gosh, there's a lot that immediately comes to mind. I think when I read the book, I was most inspired because I think that our tradition is uniquely poised to do the types of thing that this book recommends to do. It was written by a bunch of Presbyterians and Reformed kind of evangelicals, And I think that they have really good things to say to their tradition. But every single thing that they were bringing up, not every single thing, but many of the things that they were bringing up, I'm like, oh, we wouldn't even have to pivot.
Yeah.
This is what it means to be Anglican. This is part of our actual DNA. And so I was just found it very encouraging to read, because I was like, oh, we just got to do what our tradition is about, but maybe with a little bit more focused and point at specific problems.
Father Michael?
Yeah, and I agree wholeheartedly with Tony. That's exactly the same response that I had. And I found this to be the case with some of the more recent books I've been reading on evangelism and other things. It's like halfway through these books, I'm like, these guys are looking for the classical Anglicanism, prayer book spirituality. And so it is affirming, from my standpoint, to actually stumble across these missiologists and these thinkers who are trying to understand how to reach, people in late modernity. And halfway through the book, I'm like, man, the answer is classical Anglicanism. So that set aside, one of the things that really, well, first of all, I think it's really important to understand the person, the people that you're actually trying to engage and reach with the gospel through classical Anglicanism and the tradition. It's so easy to stay in abstracts and think in terms of blocks and numbers. But it's kind of like, I think within the ethos of Anglicanism, this idea of the cure of souls and spirituality, like we're going to need to understand the condition of the people around us. So that was the one thing that I really, again, liked about the profiles, is it kind of unfolded the inner life, the inner thinking of people and what's actually happening in and then their sadness and their tribulations as they're dealing and wrestling with Christianity and religion. But one of the things that really jumped out to me that made me rethink a little bit was a new apologetic. I mean, this whole idea of friendship.
Yeah.
One of the main themes that came out of this book and has really affected and influenced my thinking on gathering, evangelism, community within and without the church is friendship, in particular Christian friendship, as it relates to a communal means of actually reaching people and also embedding people in the faith. So that was something that just, you talk about, well, you need to invite your friends to church. Well, that's true, but there's a lot more to this need for friendship and the opportunity that Christian friendship uniquely can pose to people that are in need, because only Christian friendship can bring people to Christ. No other friendships aren't interested in that. So that was a big one for me, still influencing me.
You queued up a lot of ideas, so let's go to one of them, which is
I apologize. Sorry about that.
You talked about the profiles, and so they have, the core of the book are these 5 chapters in the middle, part 2, where they have 4 types of dechurched evangelical and 1 type of, and then sort of a grab bag of other Christians, mainline Protestants and Catholics, which are really more Catholics than mainline Protestants, but. And so the 4 types of dechurched evangelicals were cultural Christians, dechurched mainstream evangelicals, ex-evangelicals, which is not the same way that we would use that term perhaps, and then dechurched people of color. And since these authors are basically white evangelicals, it sounded like their people of color were those who had attended white evangelical churches and not black evangelical churches. So did you find any of these 4 categories either particularly vivid or relevant to you, or any of the, in each chapter they have a sort of a hypothetical fictional person who embodies some of these trends or these patterns? Is there anyone that in particular that resonates with you, either the category or the persona?
Well, I'll jump in first. I mean, not all of them drew my attention because we have more of certain personas than others,
Right.
In our context. So the Dechurched is a big one. Ex-evangelicals is another one, but the nuns are surprisingly more than people would think about. When we think of nuns, we're probably thinking, oh yeah, that guy that drops into inner city Seattle and is planting a church, but the nuns are proliferated. You think you're living, as Tony said earlier, Christianity within Christendom, right? So
Mhm.
this isn't like Christianity is in the middle of this big bubble called secular atheism. We're talking about Christians within Christianity, and that margin between the inner circle of people who are faithfully attending church and living a Christian life, and then everybody that goes from that little circle out to the edges of Christendom, those are some of the nuns and the ex-evangelicals. So it's interesting. We're in a Christian memory here. So
Right.
how do you reach and engage people that are in like a Christian hangover? It's a totally different approach than going to an atheist or a pure materialist. But I found that the ex-evangelical and the nuns and the Dechurched really created the composite of what we're dealing with here in our context.
So, and for readers who don't read the sociology of religion, when you say nuns, you're not referring to Sally Field and her Habit
Not the
and her
flying
comedy
nun.
series, but you're talking about NONES, which is none of the above when it comes to what religious affiliation they have at this time. So,
And if I can add, and nun isn't just synonymous with atheist or
no,
agnostic.
no,
Nun is really more the spiritual person who is seeking spirituality or engaging in occult or other phenomena for spiritual experience, but aren't proclaimed Christians. That's more, and I think that's really where this culture is going, by the way.
all right.
This search for reenchantment in other parts of the occult and fantastical things, but that's a whole nother podcast.
It is a whole nother podcast. Father Tony, what about these four types of evangelicals?
I mean, I think that I benefited from having them split up and focused on. I think that each group obviously has their own particularities that make sense of why they're responding or not responding. The Dechurched BIPOC group, it's just hard, to reach cross culturally. So we don't know as many of those from people of that set. But I do think that, cultural Christians, Dechurched mainstream evangelicals, ex-evangelicals, and Dechurched mainline Protestants and Catholics, those are different, but I found a lot of overlap between them. And maybe to go back to what I said earlier, I think when I read all of those profiles, it affirmed that the churches that are succeeding in reaching these groups in the Anglican tradition are doing things that are much different than the people that are not succeeding in reaching these people in the Anglican tradition. And the churches that are succeeding have two things that come to mind. They have a very hospitable, connective, relationally deep community of which to be a part. It's not a show up Sunday, do your liturgy, see you next week type of environment. They do life together as a buzzword, but I think it's important. So that's one. And the other is they have a really robust and sacramental and beautiful catechetical offering to the community. They are really being assertive in explaining to the culture around them, here is what we do, here is why we do it, and here's, and it's beautiful. But that sort of catechesis and community are the two big things that were affirmed by the 4-5 profiles. They all have elements of desiring that. That's where I found their overlap to be.
Yeah. If I can add to that, that's spot on. So deep community. So restoration, salvation, reorientation to the gospel is always communal. Salvation is always communal. You're brought into the community of the triune God. So deep community, and then I call it deep liturgy or deep formation, deep mystagogy, deep liturgy.
Anglicanism?
Anglicanism. You should write a book. But so it's that hospitable, deep community, friendship,
Yeah.
and that leads into the wonder and the beauty of God. And Tony made an important distinction. It's not just within the walls of the church. These things are communicated and lived outside of the walls. A very simple example would be in our parish, we're graced with having a beautiful property. Well, we've been very intentional to build gardens and other areas around of the beauty of God as a witness and apologetic outside of coming into the liturgy and experience God more beautifully in the sacrament and the word. We're mindful that the beauty of God can be seen on this property. But those two things, deep community and deep liturgy, just to use a catch-all phrase, are so important in my opinion. And that's exactly why we said earlier, we're poised as classical prayer book Anglicans. We already have the means, I think, to engage if we just use them.
Well, to pick up where on that, when I was reading these categories, I kind of wanted to maybe it's just my engineering nature coming to the fore. I wanted to kind of rearrange the way they present the information into two ideas, which is one is that the church didn't do enough to draw people or cement people in the faith. And the second is that the church pushed people away through its misdeeds or errors. And so in the first category, you've already said, both of you have already made reference to the idea that a lot of these evangelicals are not very well formed or very deeply formed, and that this is something we find is extremely important in Anglicanism. But also you've mentioned the fact Christian friendship, if people are embedded in their parish, in the life of their community and feel like they belong. And this is, going back to Bowling Alone, the 1990s sociology book, people want to belong and in community. And there are not many institutions anymore that pull us together as human beings rather than staring at our phones or, staring at the idiot box. And so therefore, church on Sunday morning for some people can be the most relational aspect of their week. So anyway, can you talk a little bit about kind of how you felt Anglicanism can respond to these ideas of the church not being a strong enough draw to people so that when they face, they have the foundation on sand, and when the waters rise, everything just falls apart.
I'll jump in on that. I think just a helpful way of understanding what we ought to do in response to this book within our own tradition is just to have as sort of a foil the megachurch. When I read this book, I thought everything that they're saying makes total sense when you understand that evangelicalism fell into the megachurch movement, and now it's failed and people are leaving. So if you keep that in mind, well, Anglicanism really has a good way of affording a space where people are known. They're generally not big churches. It's kind of an easy, practical understanding of how that would come about. They usually know their pastor. They know their priest. And so that's one. Create an environment where people are known. I don't know that this is always wise, but one of our church planners, Father Spencer Amaral, had a phrase that says, if I forget your name, it means we have to plant a new church, which was catchy. I think that there's limits to that.
But he was saying that basically the church has gotten too big that he doesn't know everybody's names, and so therefore we need to have another smaller church.
Yeah, that's kind of the idea.
Yeah, okay.
I think the other one is, megachurches just stopped catechizing their people. They were so much about providing an experience that had shallow roots, and so just really investing in the catechetical ministry of the church.
Okay.
I have more, but my kids are walking in right now, and it's going to get loud.
So one thing I want to, so again, Father Tony is hitting on something so important, the desire to be known. So many people experience hurt and all that stuff. A lot of the hurt that people they bring into churches like ours is because of the model of church which they were at. And if you think of the mega church or the large church, the fact that they weren't known typically is why they end up getting a hurt that could be resolved doesn't get resolved. A very quick example. We had a couple that was faithful to the megachurch, served for years in every aspect, 20 years of service in this megachurch. Their son is tragically killed. Not a single pastor or person called them. They couldn't get the church to schedule the funeral for their son at their own church.
Yeah, we had a very similar experience at our church. There's a very famous church near us, a mega church called Saddleback near us. And we had a gal who was active in her church. She was in the hospital. Nobody came to visit her. And I mean, this was decades ago. And so the rector, her friend, knew this Anglican guy, Stephen Scarlett, Father Stephen Scarlett, who came and visited her, even though he wasn't his parishioner. And when she got out of the hospital, they switched church.
Yeah, so I think that providing spaces where people can be deeply known, and giving answers that people have not been given, and talking very clearly about what the faith is. I mean, these are the recommendations in the book for cultural Christians. Cultural Christians, you're supposed to be really clear about what the gospel is, about what the faith teaches, give really good provocative answers to good questions. And then for the dechurched mainliners, you're supposed to create spaces where they can be connected relationally.
Yeah,
that's the bulk. That's the bulk of who we see.
Right.
We see a bunch of cultural Christians and dechurched mainline evangelicals, or dechurched mainliners. And so the thing that I want to add, though, is the one thing that the megachurch did well is that they were very extrinsic in terms of their ministry. They weren't purely attractional. And I think that a lot of Anglican churches are really strong in terms of their pastoral care. Maybe less so, but still generally the case. They create contexts for deep relationships and community. But the ones that are succeeding in reaching the culture have an extrinsic ministry, an external ministry. Page 50 in the book talks about running broadly with this idea: what if cultural Christians were to find their way into the metaphorical forecourt of the church and then enter its inner court where deep saving faith can be found? It says later on page 51, that liminal space where people are still exploring, examining the faith, and in community with those with deep faith is important. And so I think that as long as there's three things required to reach most of these profiles: strong catechesis that gives actually good answers, well spoken to people, a context for deep community, and the metaphorical forecourt or liminal space, or as we call it in REC 100, the front porch.
Right.
People don't have to cross the very difficult threshold of the parish doors before they even want to be there, but you go to them. So, for Michael, he started his church with a ministry called En Fuego. They would just read theological books at the nearest cigar shop in Fuego. For me, our church started at Johnny McCracken's pub, which is the seediest bar in town, and we just did theology on tap for 6 months, and then we started the church. I think that those are lessons for how this book would teach us to respond to the culture.
Yeah, I want to pick up on that because I actually marked that same page 50, about this idea of liminal spaces, or what Bishop Sutton would call front porch ministries. But I kind of felt, I want to come to you, Father Michael, it felt to me like they were dissing belonging before believing. They said not everyone needs to belong before they believe and behave, but many do. So it's kind of like, yeah, normal evangelicals will talk you into the faith, and then you'll believe what we tell you, and then you'll join. But I know, Father Michael, your entire ministry has been built around this belonging below believing. And so what did they miss by not really giving more emphasis or more understanding of that approach?
Well, so, and I'm only guessing because I don't know what they're thinking. I think part of it has to do with they may be in a tradition, or they're in their own spirituality, that they're still very concerned with thinking rightly about God.
Oh, that comes through the book very strongly.
So, and Tony, you may have experienced this. You're going to have people that are looking for pure doctrine, the true church, whatever. And they may just come in because they've studied your website, they've read the 39 articles, and then there they are. But those people, unless it becomes incarnational and sacramental and moves beyond merely this understanding of right doctrine, and I'm in the place where I can at least know that we're not heretics, they're not going to they will not be embedded into the faith or the community. So in their minds, they could see how people could just research the right church or denomination or pastor and say, that's where we're going to go. And that's all they're really looking for, because it's disembodied, and their lives probably mirror a certain level of disembodiedness and lack of sacrament. It hasn't come together for them. And that's why so many people jump around churches, because they don't like certain points and finer points of doctrine. It's all here. It doesn't include this, which means it doesn't include other people.
Yeah, I'd like to pick up on that, because that was the other thing that really struck me about this, not sufficiently formed Christians was, we form people by prayer, by the, kinesthetic, standing, sitting, kneeling. We form people by liturgy, habit of liturgy. We form people through sacraments. And that, of course, obviously, those are all alien to their non-denom. So how do you feel that those aspects of Anglicanism as a sacramental liturgical church might do a better job? Because one of the themes here is we want to form people so we don't lose them. So how can we address this issue to inoculate our members against falling away?
So I think it's really important. I know earlier I said that I had I saw a lot of overlaps between the groups. And I do think that for me, I condensed the book into the three things that I had mentioned earlier, community, catechesis, and front porch. But there are distinctions between the groups. So you brought up, Joel, about, their critique of belonging before believing. But, keep in mind that was in the Cultural Christians chapter. They would have said the exact opposite in the Dechurched mainline ones, because the idea is that the Cultural Christians, they don't know or believe the faith.
Okay.
And they don't know that they want to believe the faith. And so, so for me, as a church planter, we just ran our first Alpha. Guess who was the people in the Alpha? It was all Cultural Christians. People that Marietta has 9 mainline churches just on their square. These are people that have been, they've just been around the faith, but they'd never taken that step in. They don't want to be befriended. They want to have a space where they can think through stuff. Now, that's opposite for the dechurched mainliners. They do believe the faith. They believe the core tenets of the faith. They just never had anyone give 2 craps about them. And the faith that was probably, offered to them within their, liberalizing mainline church was so lame that they just fell away. And so there's just different nuances that I think really do come out when you understand the distinct profiles. At the end of the day, a church is going to have to come up with a strategy for how to reach the culture as something somewhat monolithic. But if you're trying to understand, why did this group of people respond to this and not this group? I do think that the profiles do give some nuance there.
Yeah, I agree with that as well. But I do think that I would say also, but there is a general belonging.
Yes.
As Tony mentioned earlier, the desire to know and to be known, to love and to be loved. Even people that want a space to come in and get those answers, questions, or think through the faith, they don't want to do that alone, because that's partly why they don't know the answers. They've tried to do things on their own. So these are kind of universals in one respect, but there are a lot of nuance depending on who is coming to your parish or mission with the background they're bringing in. How did you
Yeah.
do?
So when I was sent out as a church planter, I think this will be really helpful. Bishop Sutton had the image of a front porch, but he also had the image of a net.
Yeah.
And he used to talk about you don't want to throw a hook in the water. You want to throw out a net that has many squares. And I remember hearing that and being like, I think I understand that. And I think he's right. In working with a lot of church planners, they're like, okay, net with many squares. We're going to have a sewing ministry, and we're going to have, a prayer ministry, and we're going to have a theology, and they kind of just shoot from the hip. I think that if I were to read this book, and I was surrounded by a significant number of people from each category, the squares on my net would be things that were uniquely suited to reach that group. So, for instance, the dechurched, the cultural Christians. They don't believe or understand the faith, but they want a space where they can think through it for themselves, a safe space. We did Alpha. That was direct. That square in our net was specifically for those fish. The dechurched evangelical. They believe the dechurched mainliner. They believe it, but they've just never heard it talked about clearly. We did Theology on Tap to reach that group. That's exactly what they need. That's a silver bullet for dechurched mainliners. Do Theology on Tap or in Fuego. It's a great idea. The ex-evangelicals, they need to talk to a priest that cares about them. And so we have on our website, have a pint with a priest. Usually an ex-evangelical is usually reacting against the teetotalism of evangelicalism, and they've never had people that they could talk to and care about them. So Pints with a Priest is our square in the net to reach ex-evangelicals. Mm-hmm. And I can keep going on, but I do think that that's how we've used the profiles. Is we don't shoot from the hip on almost anything we do. We try to aim very, very specifically at a unique cultural set, and we try to really tailor our outreach to them. Does that help?
Yeah, I would love to have you come speak to my strategy students, except I don't have a strategy class anymore, but we teach business strategy. Strategy means choosing to do things means choosing not to do other things because you have finite resources. And so you're basically saying we can only have so many squares on our net. Let's have squares that target a big population and also that will be effective for that audience. But anyway, I want to move on to something else that you both have touched on, which is, as in my typology or refactoring, which may not survive, there were certainly the causes that push people away from the church. And one of the big ones was politics. And I just looked at this and said, why? The pastor or the church members were so political that if my politics didn't exactly match theirs, I didn't want to go there. And I'm thinking, why would a church be organized around politics, or why would the pastor be preaching from the pulpit? So their answer seems to be have a virtuous middle of the road political position where you say pox on both their houses. Is that how you treat politics in your churches?
That's a great question for Father Melton.
I read the stuff on politics on this. I really have experienced that in terms of a generational thing. I think that the younger the priest, the more likely he is to be a little bit more like you said. It's not to say I'm a very conservative guy. Mm-hmm. I was raised in Southwest Missouri. I'm like fourth cousins to Rush Limbaugh. And if I'm going to preach on anything but abortion, I am throwing pox on both sides.
I think probably euthanasia would be up there too.
Yeah, sure. Anything to do with life.
Yeah.
Anything to do with life. But I do think that a lot of, we have to keep in mind that the dechurching of evangelicalism is not just we're not just dealing with the aftermath of the megachurch movement, but also the extreme politicization of evangelicalism that happened in the 70s through the 2000s. I mean, it was this was what it meant to be evangelical. It was a political movement in a lot of respects. And so we're dealing with the aftermath of like so many of the people that have left, especially the ex-evangelical crowd. They're just tired of Christians unthinkingly marrying themselves to whatever Republicans say. And I vote Republican.
I was struck by the fact that, I have my wife's best friend is a liberal Methodist. And when they visited us over the winter, I said, an Anglican priest got fired because he was too active in politics. And they said, what? We want our Methodist pastor to take political views on social media and talk about political issues and what the correct response of the church is. And obviously, many of the mainline Protestants are doing that now on the other side from the evangelicals. And I just don't, in my experience, Anglican churches, not part of the Episcopal Church, don't tend to take political positions.
I mean, I don't want to cast any stones. Who am I to say what should be in another man's conscience? I'll say for me, I think people are deeply hungry for finding Christ in the historic church. We are extremely strong and vocal about certain things, like I said, about life. But when it comes to other things, I found myself unable to be helpful speaking in a political, voice. And it's always had negative backlash that is distracting from things that are far more important. So one of the things I will add, though, is that those liminal spaces that I've talked about have given me as a priest a lot more liberty to talk about these types of things in ways that don't have those negative backlashes. So we've had a lot of political conversations at our church, but they've always been at Theology on Tap, where people are,
Disarmed.
Yeah, they're disarmed.
Yeah. Can I add something?
Yeah.
I kind of have I think there's another aspect to this kind of this rejection or I don't want politics. I think what I've observed is any tradition or church, tradition, evangelical free church, Bible church, when they have an anemic spirituality or a limited spirituality, they're going to fill that space with something.
Amen.
Typically that takes shape in terms of missional zeal. We're all about reaching people, the gospel community, let's go, which is good. Or they become activists. Hey, social justice, we're all about loving people. And then every sermon, everything's about cultural engagement and justice. Imagine a Christian who spends their whole life serving in the nursery. Faithful, but what would be the state of their soul if their discipleship only ever centered around going to big church and then serving in the nursery? So I think what happens is politics is another one of these areas that fills the void and captures people's attentions because they don't have nothing else to do or think about. It's escapist in a way, but it's because they don't really have a depth of spirituality like we might find in the prayer book spirituality, to actually lead them into the cure of their soul. And this is why so many young evangelicals recoil at politics, because they went through all that and they're still sorrowful, broken, and sad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, people in evangelicalism care so deeply about politics because they haven't ascended into heaven and sung the Sanctus with the angels and archangels for decades. And so their entire worldview is horizontal. But for Anglicans, we ascend and descend every week. And so we actually can have a self-differentiated relationship with the world around us that's not enmeshed within whatever party we're being proffered. I think that's one of those things from Anglican tradition that I think would be really helpful in avoiding what they really lay at the boomers' feet. I don't know if you saw that in there, but one of the overlays around the political divides that are causing people to leave the church, there was another statistic in that they found it very difficult to talk to their boomer grandparents
Mhm.
about politics. I think that those are deeply connected. We're dealing with not only the aftermath of a highly politicized evangelical church, but those people that came from there, that were raised in that, are now leading or significant members of our churches.
It felt like they were really putting a lot of blame on parents and grandparents, that either A, you didn't form your kids well enough, or B, to the point you're making, Father Tony, that you were so set in your political ways that you didn't listen to your children when they had other views and understand them and have conversations with them. Did that resonate with you? Because to me, it felt, I can see how that would happen, but maybe it's just I'm around people who have healthier parents than that. I don't know.
Oh, I don't think it means you have unhealthy parents. I think this is a very common phenomenon.
Yeah.
I just think that this is the way that boomers were catechized. What is it to be Christian? To be Christian is to love Ronald Reagan and to be a red-blooded Republican. And
I think that's in the Southeast, not in California.
maybe, but and that's where I serve, to be fair.
Yeah.
And I say that as a conservative, but I think that there are differences between the faith and the Republican Party.
Yeah, of course.
And people have just felt unlistened to
Right.
about their very true and good reactions to these things as Christians, and then they're like, "That's all right, I'm out."
Right.
So I do think that there's some real truth to what they're pointing out there, and that I have seen that with my parishioners. I've experienced that. So
Okay.
something to be learned.
Well, we certainly in the continuing world, we have a lot of parishes in the Southeast, so I'm sure it would be equally relevant for them as well.
Well, which is why, just to add on, casting an intergenerational vision for people's lives. When you talk about, we talk a lot about marriage, number one. People got to get married. But when you start talking about a world in which parents and grandchildren and their kids and families generationally living the same tradition and being in the same parish, even though that's hard to do because of life, that's it. Why does that resonate so much with people? There's a reason, because it's fractured. And I think the comments that they make on the family dynamics is they're just scratching the surface of a far deeper cultural phenomenon, an issue we've been dealing with between family relation, people. It's far beyond just this little book.
Mhm.
Talk about casting an intergenerational cohesive family vision of faith. People are like, yes, God, I want that. I want my children with me in church. I want my grandkid. People are hungry for that. It's huge.
Yeah.
So risk just a brief detour before we wrap up. There was one other thing I thought was interesting. They took a rather controversial stand arguing that online worship services are a cheap substitute that fool people. And I noticed that neither of you actually have churches that stream services, but you have close ties to the two REC Dallas churches that do.
No, we stream our services badly.
Yeah, we do
Okay.
too. Yeah, we do it badly as well.
Well, their claim is that basically if people can leave the church by just sitting on their couch rather than actually thinking they've left the church by not doing any church, that just kind of fools them into leaving an actual church experience. So
Well, that's why we do it poorly. No, I'm serious. There's two reasons why we do it inadequately. Literally, we have an iPhone. Okay, no mics. That's why it's so bad. But number one is we don't want people to think that that's church. Number two, there's this ethic and value of overproduction that begins to snap of inauthenticity. We're living in a culture that like mediocre is really great. And if it's too polished, I'm suspect. So there's also it puts a value like this is helpful, but it's not that important.
Okay.
So that it creates a priority within some people's minds in terms of value, and it's not a substitute. And so that's some of the reasons why we're just really bad streaming services.
Father Tony?
Yeah, I mean, people find us all the time, and they check us out for our streaming services. I feel like, people go on the internet to find answers to things, and especially I think of like the mainline, or I'm sorry, the dechurched Roman Catholics and mainliners, also the dechurched evangelicals. They're both trying to figure out, like, are there other traditions that are deeper and better than the one I was raised in? They are really asking that question, and they just don't know. And then you have the people like the nuns that just have never been, and it's kind of scary. And so, I mean, a live stream is at least a decent way, I find, to like, I know that this is going to not be, they're not sacrificing chickens,
Yeah, it's a window. I think of it as a window.
Yeah.
Because as I said, and Tony, like, if you say, hey, come to church with me, and I'm in Rockwall, Texas, somebody's like, okay, yeah, it's going to be a box church. There's going to be 3 songs, welcome, a sermon, a song, and then we're going to go home. If I say, hey, come to St. Benedict's, they have no idea what they're going to get into. So it gives people a window to look in and say, well, at least they're like Tony said, they're not sacrificing chickens. Actually looks interesting. So it is an important window. But
I'll just say you can't do it really badly. It's got to be in the middle. And the other thing I'd say is, most people get information through podcasts. I mean, we're making a podcast right now. They also like sermon clips. These are just these are ways that people receive the ministry of the word. It's just the reality of it. This is how they receive it. And so, we use Pulpit AI, not to write our sermons, but to I plug in a sermon and it gives me like 10 different things that I can utilize in a snap to reach people through social media and all of that. This is so easy.
Mm-hmm.
So easy. I mean, if you put 10 hours, if you put 5 hours into a sermon, that's going to bless people, especially if it's, 60-second, clips that it picks out for you. I just feel like live streaming is so easy, and it's, it doesn't take any time really. I would just recommend church planters to do that. So,
Okay.
Me too.
but if they don't, I don't really care.
Okay.
I just think
All
it's
right. Well, at this point, why don't we just go ahead and kind of have any last thoughts from you? Do either of you have any other thoughts you wanted to share about the book?
I do. Yeah. So I think that one of the biggest transitions that's happening in the Anglican Church at large is that we're trying to reckon with the fact that we are in post-Christendom, and that people don't give a crap about what we offer until we help them give a crap about what we offer. And so there's this idea that I'm constantly confronting and consulting with churches and helping with them planting churches, that there's this mentality that all I have to do is hang a shingle. All I have to do is start a liturgy, and, gosh darn it, people will like me and they'll come. And that's just not the case.
Right.
The people in the Great Dechurching are enough removed. There's a space between you and them. And unless you understand them and understand that space, you won't be able to cross it effectively. But it does mean that you have to know what you're shooting for and then move out from where you are. And that to me is the biggest insight for the church at large, is you're not living in Christendom anymore, and you need to start acting like that. And then only whenever someone has that transition, that paradigm shift, do I think it actually helpful in forming a strategy. Again, I think the 3 key takeaways for me were deep community, the opportunity to find great relationships, catechesis, and then that kind of going out, that liminal space, front porch.
Father Michael.
Yeah, and I think that's a good encapsulation. And I would just add that there is hope in this book, because it does reveal the cracks in the Teflon that people put up when they're dechurched or desensitized.
Yes.
But no front is impenetrable. There are cracks in every person's front, so to speak, that we can come through. The gospel can speak into. So you got to know what those things are. And you got to know then strategically how you're going to get in there. But they're not going to come looking for you. They're not going to squeeze through their crack and talk to you. You got to go in, and you got to find creative, imaginative, and sacramental ways to do that. But there is hope. Obviously, the Holy Spirit, God is reaching people. People are coming to churches. And I'm not just talking about shifting populations. We're seeing conversions. I mean, we've had several people that were not Christians, literally not Christians, not just they were out from a Bible church.
Yeah.
So God is working, but you got to know who the people are. But you also need to know that there are ways in that the broken condition, the fall, human life just presents. And we just need to be sensitive to those things and then come through with the grace and mercy of the gospel.
That's right.
Boy, I can't think of a better way to end our talk. So thank you both, Father Michael, Father Tony. Appreciate your time and sharing your experience and your insights on how to deal with this important phenomenon. On behalf of Continuing Forward, thank you for attending, everyone, and hope to see you again at our next webinar.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Joel.